I'm George Beckwith. I'm the Regional Director for Children's Legal Services for the Northeast region. My partner, Bruce McIntosh, MD, he's our statewide CPT Director. We're going to talk to you about common false defenses in child abuse cases and how to overcome them. So before we start, I want to get an idea of who we have in the audience. So do we have, how many lawyers? Well, first of all, how many CLS lawyers? Right, nice. How many prosecutors? Right. No defense attorneys, right? Because I was going to have to ask you to leave. So no defense attorneys, doctors, experts, right? Nice. Case managers, we got investigators. So we got the whole group. Law enforcement.
Red Sox fans.
Yeah, as you know, my gratuitous nod to my team. Do we have any law enforcement officers, detectives? Okay, well, one of the themes that I want to go into is collaboration, because I know that we've talked, if you guys have been in this room for the last several hours, we've talked about getting all the facts and presenting it to your expert. And I'm not minimizing that by any means. We've got to know all the facts of our case, both the good and the bad. You want to make sure that you and your expert work collaboratively. In the dependency world, we don't always have defense experts. I don't know how many of you guys ever have like high-level defense experts. What I find in my, having done this for a while, they might throw a defense out there or a theory, but they never really back it up with a heavy hitter who's going to come in and testify to it. But nonetheless, always anticipate that they may come up with some expert out of their back pocket or from whatever rock they might crawl out from under to come up with some bogus reason for the injury to the child. But you want to work collaboratively with your expert. I don't want to underscore that, because when we're on the same sheet of music, that's how our case flows. Whether it's in front of a jury or a judge, we have to be on the same sheet of music. We want to provide the expert with all of our evidence that we have, both good and bad. If there are depositions, you want to give them to the expert, because someone may say something in that deposition that may tip the expert off to their theory or another theory, or may help them solidify or bolster their theory. You always want to maintain regular maintain regular communication with your expert. Don't just send them a subpoena and say, we'll talk to you when you get served. You want to reach out. You want to let them know what's in store for them, what the other side is saying, who the other side's expert is. Anyway, you want to make sure that once you have that first meeting, that's not the last meeting. And again, you don't want to have that first meeting right outside the courthouse or the day before. Dr. Alexander said earlier, when he's involved with cases from other states, he seems to get more communication from those lawyers from the other states. And that's a real shame, because I have the Northeast region. Dr. Alexander and Dr. McIntosh, luckily for me and my staff, they sit right in Jacksonville. So if we're not picking up the phone and talking to them, or maybe even swinging by, then we need to do a better job. So I just want to make sure that our folks, any CLS folks, if you're listening, please reach out and constantly keep in communication with them. And always tell them if the case settled. Don't wait till they get to the courthouse and say, oh yeah, by the way, we're not going to need you, doctor. That's not fair. So we want to work together with the expert to develop our theory on how the harm to the child occurred. Once you've determined the likely cause, you and your expert can talk about the potential defenses. Once you determine that the defense expert will likely be, you can start doing your research. You might find that, I know that I've had talks with Dr. Alexander on cases over the years, and he'll say, oh yeah, that's just so-and-so. They're so full of crap that, this case or whatever had blah, blah, blah. So a lot of these people are known. They make a living out of going around the country. They're like, I guess it's like a carnival, right? They come into town, they do their piece, and then they leave with their check from the defense. But you can look at them, you can Google them. Google's wonderful. You can Google a name and you can find out all the things that they've done as far as been like brought up on charges or had their certifications removed or those kind of things. Wonderful things to bring up on defense. So once you and your expert have gotten together, you've reviewed all the facts, you've developed your theory, you've been in constant communication, you got to put on your boots because it's about to get pretty deep. This is a case study. I don't want to go into painstaking detail, but it was a case I had that it was an expedited termination of parental rights on the father of a 2-year-old. he was the perpetrator of abuse on the mother's 5-year-old son. Now, this guy was 6'4", 300 pounds, so he was my height, but he outweighed me by 60 pounds, just a big gorilla. And the injury was a tear to the child's. I became an expert on the mesenteric sheath because I had no idea what that was until this case. But apparently there's a sheath that holds in all your guts. And when that gets perforated, your guts come out. And if you're not treated, you die. So this guy punched this kid, according to the child, punched him in the stomach with such force that it split him open. And the guy was not man enough to admit that he did it. So when the mom came home and the kid was in agony, this guy whose real name is Adam, his real name is Kelsey, but he wanted to go by Adam because Kelsey sounded too feminine. So in the trial I kept calling him Kelsey just to try to get out of it. And it worked. He said, I don't know what happened. He fell off, we were playing roughly and he jumped off the bunk bed and landed on his football. That's how it happened later. But until they knew that he was about to die. Before that, he's driving around with the mother saying, I don't know, let's get him some kaopectate. Maybe that'll stop his stomach ache. And the mother's like, I don't know what's wrong with him. And then here's the kid in agony in the back seat, afraid to tell the mother what really happened. So long story short, they life flight him to Arnold Palmer. 2 surgeons saved his life. This guy ultimately gets arrested, but is not saying anything, and he's going to go to trial in the criminal case. But we had this case, the corresponding termination of parental rights case. So the end of the story is we won. He's in prison doing 15 years, but what I wanted to bring out was collaboration with your expert is great, but if you're a CLS attorney, you want to collaborate with the prosecutor who's handling that criminal case. Because I know when I was a prosecutor, I would have killed to have somebody call me up and say, hey, I've got the same fact pattern pretty much that you do. I've got to prove it to a judge by clear and convincing evidence, not to a jury of several people that are too stupid to get out of jury duty. Let's collaborate. Let's talk about how we can save resources, how we can keep a kid from having to be questioned many times. Right? In this case, I had the child testify by closed-circuit TV, and I had the perpetrator in the holding cell. His lawyer was present, and we rehearsed with the kid, and it ended up being a really, really good exercise in allowing a kid to tell the story. And by the time it went to trial, he was 7, so he was a little bit older, but he had ADD issues, much like myself. So he was kind of all over the place. So I had to meet with him several times and brought him to the courthouse and all those kind of things to help him through this. But the whole time I was reaching out to the prosecutor on the case, and I never got a call back. And I'm like, really? So finally I called the state attorney, who I know, and I said, what's the deal? Oh, that doesn't happen under my watch. Well, yeah, it did. So after I talked to him, though, my phone rang, and it was the prosecutor. Hey, I'd like to meet with you and talk about that case. So sometimes you have to take that next step. But it's really imperative that we share because they may have different experts. In my case, it was Dr. Michael Bell, our CPT doctor in Volusia, who really hadn't even been approached by the prosecution about what was going on in that case. Now, ultimately, he pled after the TPR when I said, you might want to go look at the transcript of the great thing, because I called him as a witness, and he invoked his 5th privilege, and then I used the case law to say that that's an assumption that he's doing so because he's hiding his guilt. Anyway, long story short, we have to collaborate with our experts and our state attorneys, and vice versa. If they call you, we need to help them. We're all on the same side working for the same good. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Mack to talk about all the good stuff like guts and bowels and all that fun stuff.
Good afternoon, guys. And there are 2 extra seats up here. There are 2 seats up here if anybody wants to come up here. We seem to be living in an era now of alternative facts. And we're going to be talking now about alternative theories of causation, which will commonly come up in these cases, whether they're dependency cases or criminal cases. And the plan of attack is going to be, we're going to look at 3 false explanations for abusive head trauma injuries. We'll look at 3 false explanations for multiple fractures in infants. And we'll look at 1 false theory on sexual abuse and assault cases and 3 reasons why they're wrong. So there's a pattern to what we're going to be doing here. Basically, with the review of abusive head trauma, we'll take a minute to talk about the terms abusive head trauma and shaken baby syndrome, and then we'll talk about the three false theories. Shaken baby syndrome is often presented by defense and family attorneys as an unfounded theory that someone dreamed up out of thin air, and it's not. The first, actually this is the first report in American literature was by Dr. John Caffey back in 1974, an English doctor, Dr. Gufkelch, described it a year before, but he doesn't get as much attention. But this is the title of his paper, which I think is the longest title I've ever read in a medical journal. The whiplash shaken, we lost the term whiplash, but whiplash shaken infant syndrome, manual shaking by the extremities with whiplash-induced intracranial and intraocular bleedings linked with residual permanent brain damage and mental retardation. He didn't dream this up. He talked to people about what they had done to their babies. And at a time in '74 when people weren't hiding their guilt because it just wasn't thought to be that bad to shake babies, people would tell him, well, right before the baby went limp, I shook it and then he went limp. There were statements, they weren't so much confessions at the time because they were just being interviewed and said this is what happened. So it's not a theory, it's based on, on things people have said. So it's not a theory and it's not new. This is an article from 1937 about a man who was convicted of shaking a child again. So this is not new. It's well recognized and generally accepted that you can and do cause permanent brain damage and kill infants by violently shaking them. Having said that, we have moved away from the term, and this is important for everyone to know, we've moved away from the term shaken baby syndrome and are now using the term abusive head trauma. Why is that? Two reasons. One, there was a researcher some years ago who published an article claiming to prove that it was impossible to shake a baby to death. A whole lot of reasons why they didn't actually prove that. But if you use the term shaken baby syndrome, you invite the defense to bring in someone who will say there's no such thing. So I will never in one of my reports talk about shaken baby syndrome. I'm going to talk about abusive head trauma, which is the preferred term for the American Academy of Pediatrics. Why is that? Well, what usually triggers shaking or abusive head trauma? It's usually that an infant or child has been crying, okay? And if you're angry with the child and you're shaking him until he shuts up, you're probably not then going to gently lay him down. You are probably going to throw him into the crib. Or if you're dealing with a crying baby at 2 o'clock in the morning and you're standing there by the crib with him, you're going to go, shut up, wham, wham, wham. And you're going to slam his head on the mattress. Now, if you throw him against the wall or the floor, he'll have bruising and a fracture. But if you slam him on a crib mattress or a sofa cushion, there's impact, but there's not bruising or fractures. So what we now know is that a lot of babies that we might at one time have just called shaken have also been impacted. And we can't always tell whether they've just been shaken, just been impacted on a soft surface, or been shaken and impacted. So the term abusive head trauma includes both of those concepts, shaking and impact. Now, you will have experts or defense attorneys who will try to tell you, oh, the American Academy of Pediatrics has even now disavowed the term shaken baby syndrome. Even they don't believe it's real. Well, no, that's not true. The statement says that shaken baby syndrome is a subset of abusive head trauma. It's those abusive head trauma babies who have only been shaken, and that the goal of the policy was not to detract from that concept. This is at the lower right-hand corner of the column as you look at the page. So don't let anyone tell you that the American Academy of Pediatrics has disavowed the concept of shaken baby syndrome. We just have a better, more inclusive term. Here's another case, probably still in progress. The babysitter lost her temper with us and threw him into the playpen. I'm betting money that she shook him before she threw him into the playpen. Okay, so what are some of the defenses? Okay, and we can't get into all the reasons why, all the details of shaken baby syndrome, because we're really going to be focusing on the defenses. One of the earlier, most common defenses against shaken baby syndrome, against abusive head trauma cases, was the so-called shortfall defense. That would still come up. Dr. John Plunkett is one of those experts who travels the country making a six-figure income, testifying in cases where people have killed or seriously injured their babies. To bolster himself, he published an article some years ago. He went to the Consumer National Safety Data Council database and looked at cases of fatal head injuries from short distance falls from playground equipment. Okay. Now, it's playground equipment, it's not beds and couches, and you'll notice the age. Most kids with abusive head trauma are less than a year old. There's not a child here who's less than a year old. And he claimed to show, he accumulated this series of supposed deaths from short distance falls. Now, this is a chart from his thing, and you can't read that, but case 5 is a case in which the grandmother was videotaping the child playing on a little play gym in the garage, and the distance of the fall was said to be 2.3 feet, which is about the height of a couch or a bed. I can't show you the video right now, but I have a copy of the video, and 2.3 feet was the height of the floor of the play gym. The child was sitting on the top wall around the top of that. Her head was up here, so her head really fell 5 or 6 feet to a concrete floor. Okay, that is nothing like a 2 foot 3 inch or 4 inch fall. So Dr. Plunkett, what I'm saying is Dr. Plunkett falsified his data in this report. Okay, so Plunkett is not a credible person, but he will show up from time to time. Dr. Alexander, a lot of the travel that Dr. Alexander describes is going around the country countering Dr. Plunkett. Another thing about, let me point out, whenever you see a slide that has a bull up, that means that's not good medical literature. Other cases that Plunkett included in his case series of shortfall deaths were kids who actually fell from playground equipment. Now, like they're at the height of the backswing on a swing, and they fall out of the swing and land on the back of their head. That's not falling off a bed. Mass lesions, that's really big blood clots. Vascular accidents, one case he included was a child who fell on a stick, tore his carotid artery, and stroked. Abnormalities of the blood coagulation system. It's a child who had a condition called ITP where they don't have enough blood clotting elements, and so they bleed spontaneously. So this is a mixed bag, including uncorroborated histories where someone just said, hey, something happened, then he died. So this is a mixed bag of really worthless stuff. It's a garbage in, garbage out kind of article. So Plunkett, shortfall defense, not credible. But you may have to have your experts help explain that. This is some of the reliable medical literature of these 1, 2, 3, 4 different articles spanning 20 years where people have looked at what actually does happen when children fall out of beds and couches. And in all of these cases, there were no fatal deaths. So kids don't kill themselves falling off of beds and couches. I wish I could say that never happened, but it can happen rarely. This is a reliable study done by Dr. Chadwick, who's a reliable researcher. He looked at statistics from California, from the CDC, and from the National Consumer Product Safety Commission, and he found like 0.48 cases per million of short distance falls causing deaths, 3 out of a million. And he summed to say that the chance of a child dying from a short distance fall is about 1 in 1. Okay, so it can happen, but it's extremely rare. And these kids, when we see these abusive head trauma cases, they don't look like anyone who had a fall. They really look very different in the distribution of the blood and so forth. So your medical expert should be able to help you deal with this short distance fall defense. Don't be put off your case by it. This is Dr. Ushinsky, who is a neurosurgeon who used to also make a good living traveling around the country. As I go through these false defenses, one thing I want you to notice is how often they have actually been tested in court and have been found deficient. So juries tend not to believe these false defenses, so don't be scared off by them. But Dr. Ushinsky was actually censured by his professional society for testifying as an advocate rather than as an impartial fact witness. So if you ever have Ushinsky show up on the defense witness list, this is a handy thing to know. Now, along the line of the shortfall defense, another kind of defense that's connected with it is people who try to use biomechanical studies. This is the kind of studies that have been done to improve car safety and that kind of thing. They have dolls with measurements in them to measure how things work. And they claim to show, again, that it's impossible to shake a child sufficiently hard as to cause injury. But nobody has actually measured the force that it takes to cause injury. I mean, how could you do that study? You couldn't study children and shake them and cause injury. So there are no numbers to show what that force would be. And the dolls, none of them are accurate representations of human babies. So you have a flawed numbers and a flawed model. So none of these, while it's interesting data for making cars safe, it's not really ready for prime time in the courthouse, but you will have biomechanical experts come in and testify to the effect that the child can be killed or seriously injured by short distance falls. This is one of those guys who has actually been charged with perjury. He's a biomechanical person. John Lloyd is his name. If he shows up on the defense's witness list, be aware that he's been charged with perjury for having falsely presented his credentials at a trial. So again, this is the kind of people that you have going around testifying to these false theories. Okay. So, short distance fall is one theory. Another theory is the bleed-rebleed scenario. Now, the story here is that after head trauma that causes a subdural hematoma to form, most of the time the body will dissolve that subdural hematoma. Most of the time that blood just goes away. Usually surgeons don't need to go in and operate. The blood just goes away. But sometimes the body will form a little membrane around that subdural hematoma, a pseudomembrane, and there will be tiny blood vessels in that pseudomembrane. So the bleed-rebleed theory is that something minor, maybe just birth, maybe some minor fall, causes the child to develop a small subdural, something so small, so innocuous, nobody even knows the child has it. And then later, some minor trauma, some trip and fall, some minor something, makes those tiny little blood vessels in that membrane burst, and blood floods into the head, and the child collapses and dies. Okay, this was it's called the bleed-rebleed theory. It's also called the Soddy defense, S-O-D-D-I. Some other dude done it. I mean, that somebody else caused the minor injury and then the child collapsed later. This was, some of you may be mature enough to remember the Matthew Eapen trial, the Matthew Eapen case that was the au pair trial up in Boston. Matthew Eapen was a child who suffered a fatal head injury while in the care of a young woman from England working as an au pair with the family. And the defense was that the parents, both of whom were doctors, that's why they had an au pair looking after their child. The defense was that the doctor's parents had inflicted the fatal injury, but the child had acted well until he suddenly collapsed a couple of days later in the au pair's care. So that's how that case is offered. That's how that defense is offered. Bleed-rebleed. Old minor injury, acute bleed later. The jury didn't buy it. Okay, she was convicted. So again, that doesn't necessarily fly. It'll be offered, but with the help of your with the help of your child protection team expert, you ought to be able to overcome that defense if it's offered. The reality is that these neomembranes, when they do form, and they do form, are tiny blood vessels that ooze. They don't gush blood, they ooze, so that they don't bleed at areas that are different from where the original injury was, and the bleeds are really asymptomatic. The only case I personally have ever seen was one where someone ordered a CT scan for another reason and found a tiny little rebleed. The child was no different, so they're asymptomatic. So while there is such a thing as a rebleed, they're clinically insignificant and don't cause sudden decompensation. Tiny vessels that ooze. Okay. Dr. Ayoub was someone who testified in the au pair case. He was a guy who'd done some research. Actually, I can show you. There you go. He did some research back in the 1960s when they were improving the safety of cars, making better bumpers, seat belts, headrests, that kind of thing. He did research with monkeys, and this is where he's whiplashing a chimpanzee, okay? The chimpanzee's at a sled chair, a piston shoots it forward, and the chimpanzee's neck whips back, okay? So he did a lot of animal research. Well, they needed an expert, so invited this guy who worked with monkeys to come in and testify in the defense of the au pair who had been killed, Matthew Eapen. And he claimed that you can't have a brain injury if you don't have a neck injury because the neck is much more sensitive. Absolutely false, absolutely not true. I've only seen 1 or 2 cases that I've been involved in of abusive head trauma that have actually had neck injuries. So don't be put off by the fact that there's no neck injury. Okay. Another popular false theory is the Geddes hypothesis, or the Geddes unifying hypothesis, or the Geddes universal hypothesis. She's from England, and she proposed that some craniocervical injury from a relatively minor trauma, any little thing, might cause a child to stop breathing temporarily. That's apnea, stop breathing. And that would result in hypoxia and cerebral edemas. Hypoxia, of course, is lack of oxygen going to the brain. And she says that this lack of oxygen in the brain causes cerebral edema. That causes the pressure in the veins in the brain to build up, and that causes the bleeding in the subdural space and the bleeding in the back of the eyes. That's what she speculated and produced this article in 2003. Well, this article was, of course, great news to people who had been recently convicted of abusive head trauma in England. So they were flooded with appeals based on Dr. Geddes' idea that, hey, it's just a minor thing makes them stop breathing, and then they bleed into their head. Well, so there were appeals being heard because of this. So, and they're the wigs that someone talked about earlier in English court here. So they called Dr. Geddes into court to explain her theory, and she said, I never meant to say that was the way it was. I was just speculating that maybe that could be the case, and we should have bigger discussions about this. So she never did any research that proved it. It was just an idea that she threw out for discussion. So the judges in Britain ruled that her unified hypothesis, that is unifying apnea, hypoxia, cerebral edema, subdural hematoma, and retinal hemorrhages, that they ruled that her hypothesis was not valid and could not be used as a defense. So then they went and considered the 4 cases on the basis of other issues. So this is important to know about, because anytime you hear a defense or a family's attorney alleging that it was something that the baby stopped breathing and he didn't have enough oxygen to his brain, and that's why he's got subdural hematoma. You're hearing some version of this, okay? So just be alert to that and don't be sucked into believing it. Why could it not be true? Well, think of situations in which we know there's a lack of oxygen to the brain. Drowning, suffocation. If lack of oxygen to the brain made you bleed into your brain and get retinal hemorrhages, we would see it all the time in all our drownings and suffocations, and we don't. So that's really obvious evidence that the theory just doesn't hold water. So those are 3 false theories for abusive head trauma and how your experts can help you counter them. Now we're going to talk about multiple fractures. And first we'll talk about some real conditions, okay, the differential diagnosis, things that your experts do have to think about with one of these cases. And then we'll talk about the false theories. Okay, osteogenesis imperfecta, the so-called brittle bone disease. It is real, it does exist. There are 4 major types that range from very, very mild, so mild sometimes people don't even know they have it, to lethal shortly after birth, and then other more severe types. Now, this is a very simplified chart. Each of these 4 types has 2 subcategories, that's 8. The last count, I think, there are like 13 different types, because they keep finding small family inbred groups that have something. But it's a fairly rare condition. Points to understand is that most of the time, because it's genetic, most of the time there's going to be a family history. Most of the time there'll be a family history. Most of the time there will be physical or x-ray findings. The bones won't look right on x-ray, or the whites of their eyes will be blue, that's a giveaway, or the bones will be deformed. So most of the time, either you have a family history or the child or the x-rays look abnormal, or both. There is a tiny chance, somebody's calculated between 1 in a million and 1 in 3 million, of a new mutation, that is a spontaneous new mutation of osteogenesis imperfecta of the mild type 1 or 4 type. That could be, I have actually in my practice seen that one. I've had my 1 in a million case, so it can happen, but it's extremely rare. If you have a case where you think, oh, I might come up as a defense, your CPT is probably going to want to talk to a geneticist to see about getting them on board to rule out that remote possibility. But that is a real thing. Other thing, real disease, rickets. Rickets is due to a lack of vitamin D. Vitamin D is necessary for healthy bones. You can take it in your diet and absorb it from your intestines, or you can form it in your skin from exposure to sunlight. So 2 ways to get vitamin D. You also can have, there's certain kidney conditions that can cause you to have rickets because you lose chemicals in your urine. So it used to be a major problem. This is what it can look like on x-ray. The ends of the bones with rickets kind of get ratty. Now this is a whole body thing, so it's not like you're going to get rickets in your right arm and not in your left arm. It's a whole body disease. So this is what rickets can look like, and this is a fracture that's happened from a fall. And even though you're not radiologists, you might be able to appreciate that this bone is not as white as it should be. It doesn't have enough calcium in it. So this is real rickets, and these bones really will break easily. So it is a real condition. But a popular defense these days is known as congenital rickets. Okay, it's the brainchild of two guys, Keller and Barnes. Okay, Keller and Barnes theorized that if the mother is deficient in vitamin D, then the baby's going to be deficient in vitamin D, and the baby will be born with weak bones. Therefore, you have 1 and 2 month-old babies with multiple fractures because their mother didn't have enough vitamin D. That's the congenital rickets argument, okay? They offered four cases, I think it was 4 or 5 cases in a publication. They said that the imaging findings were subtle and often different from older injuries. Earlier, one of our other speakers spoke about the fact that since all of you weren't in the room, it's important to be aware that the radiologist reading the original x-ray is working with the highest level of data, the most pixels, as it were, on a high-resolution screen, and he's seeing a very sharp picture. But when you ask for a copy of that to send to someone, they burn a copy that has a lot fewer pixels. And so when someone else looks at a reproduction of that original x-ray, they don't have as much information on that CD. So other experts who look at that CD are not seeing the same picture that the original radiologist did. So Keller and Barnes claim to be able to see signs of rickets that no one else can see. And they say that this could mimic abuse. When Keller and Barnes submitted this article to Pediatric Radiology, what they didn't tell the editors of the journal was that all 4 of their cases that they were presenting as a rare disease were being criminally prosecuted and pursued in dependency court. And in fact, all 4 cases ended up with either criminal and or dependency determinations. So the editors of Pediatric Radiology subsequently said, we never would have published that article if we had known that these were child abuse cases that they're presenting as a disease. That hasn't stopped them from going around the country testifying about congenital rickets, and other people will read their article and testify to the same thing. So again, it's just not good science. Likewise, the editors of radiology reviewed the x-rays and could not see what they claimed they were seeing. This is just as an example of how extreme their distortion of the facts were. This is Keller and Barnes case 4. Up on the little skeleton picture there, I've marked with X's all the sites where the child had fractures. Okay, this baby had metaphyseal chip fractures, which are highly specific for abuse, had posterior rib fractures, which are highly specific for abuse, had bilateral skull fractures, which don't happen in rickets, and had a cervical spine injury with paralysis, okay? And yet had never had vitamin D, calcium, or PTH, and I'll talk about those in a minute, never had those done, and yet still claimed that this child, on the basis of no information at all, they just claimed that this child had congenital rickets, when clearly it was an abuse case. Father was convicted, child was determined to be dependent. Now, we could get deep into the woods on vitamin D. We're not going to go there, okay? But very simply, vitamin D just isn't that important to the unborn baby. Okay, that's the foundation of their theory. Mother lacks vitamin D, therefore baby lacks vitamin D, therefore baby has weak bones. Well, the reality is that babies don't eat much, okay? So vitamin D to help them absorb calcium from their diet isn't really practicable. The placenta, this will be very interesting to you, I know, the placenta makes a hormone called placental parathyroid-related hormone that sucks calcium across the placenta from the mother to the baby. The baby gets the calcium from the mother, doesn't need vitamin D. So that vitamin D is not very important to the unborn baby. That's one of the reasons why congenital rickets is not a real thing in the United States. I wish I could tell you it doesn't exist at all, but in developing countries where you have very poor women with very poor diets, often dark-skinned, often wearing clothes that cover their whole body so that sunlight doesn't get to them, you have women who are malnourished with no calcium and vitamin D in their diet, and they're not getting vitamin D from their skin. Yes, those women are abysmally low in their vitamin D, and they do, on occasion, rarely have babies with congenital rickets. So it does exist. You're not going to see it in a child in Florida. Another theory like that is temporary brittle bone disease. It's the brainchild of a guy named Patterson, and I always like to point it that it's spelled with one T, okay? Patterson reported a series of 39 patients in which he speculated, he did no research, he just speculated that maybe these kids had a temporary lack of copper in their diet. And the lack of copper caused them to have an enzyme problem so that they couldn't make good collagen, which is the protein on which bone is formed. So therefore, they temporarily had a condition that gave them brittle bones. Inherent in his theory is that all of this was temporary, so that by the time you see the child, all he has is broken bones, okay? You can't find the low calcium, you can't find the enzyme deficiency, you can't find the abnormal collagen, because that's all gone now, okay? Another interesting case went into court, okay, in England, okay, and this is interesting. They apparently called doctors into court to explain themselves, okay. They were seeing a case in which a child had multiple fractures. He also had shearing, that's a tearing injury to the brain, multiple metaphyseal fractures of various ages, and he was testifying for the defense in that case. And the judges asked him, Dr. Patterson, suppose we end up ruling that this was in fact a case of abuse, legally recorded abuse. Suppose we do that. What are you going to do with this case? Dr. Patterson said, he's going to go in my next case series of temporary brittle bone disease, because that's what I think it is. And the judges said, thank you very much, okay, and he is no longer allowed to testify in British courts, okay. But you will, they found him an unreliable witness, okay, but you will still see, you'll hear people in the United States talking about Patterson's temporary brittle bone disease as a defense. So don't be sucked in. If someone claims that, your medical expert ought to be able to help you overcome that. The latest problem, this has reared its ugliest head around Florida. This is the latest hot topic in multiple fractures, the Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. And I'll explain to you what that is in a moment. You see the piece of clip art I have up there? Well, this is the unique theory of Dr. Michael Hollick. This is Dr. Hollick. Do I see a similarity? Is there a resemblance there? Okay, that's Dr. Hollick. He's from Boston, and anytime you come from Boston as an expert, you got credibility, okay? Yeah. And we did lose a dependency case about 2 years ago because of this guy. But he claims to be an expert in metabolic bone disease, and he claims to have seen many, many children who have this condition I'll explain in a minute, called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and that's why they have multiple fractures. He ignores all the data that goes against that. This is a picture from the Boston University website with a picture of him, and it does go ahead and say that he allows that he's not a pediatrician or a child abuse expert, but he thinks eventually he'll be vindicated in his unique theory of causation. Okay, well, let's talk a minute about what Ehlers-Danlos syndrome really is. Okay, it is an abnormality of collagen. Collagen in connective tissue of your skin, collagen in the connective tissue of your joints. Like collagen is the protein in your ligaments and your tendons and your skin. And patients who have this Ehlers-Danlos syndrome have very stretchy skin like that, or they have, here you can see where there's a scar. If he falls on his elbow, it'll tear and it'll heal with a bad scar. These people can bend their fingers. Sometimes they can bend them all the way back to touch their wrists, their joints. You know, when you see contortionists, okay, there you go. Okay. Contortionists are people largely who have this condition, and that's why they're so limber and can stretch themselves so well. So it is a real condition. It's fairly uncommon, but it is a real condition. The diagnosis is based on physical examination and the family history. There is a genetic testing that can be done, but it's not very reliable. It misses a lot of cases. So it leaves Dr. Hollick free to say that even though someone may have been tested and tested negative, he can still say that, well, they have it, they just tested negative. And that is, in fact, hard to argue with. Don't expect you to remember this, okay? This is the list of the 6 legitimate, 6 legitimate classes of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. And if you Google it, you will find references to skeletal problems, but what it's talking about is dislocations there because their tendons and ligaments are stretchy, their joints come out of shape. They have curvature of the spine, kyphosis and scoliosis, curvature of the spine and dislocations, and hip dislocations, but they don't break their bones. They don't break their bones. There's no published literature, no reliable published literature to connect Ehlers-Danlos syndrome with easily broken bones. Now, since I made this slide, Dr. Hollick has published his own study where he claims to prove that, but he's pretty much the only person who believes that. The scientific community is responding to him. This is an article written by two geneticists and endocrinologists who take him to task. So again, on the contrary, there's not been a single peer-reviewed article describing the increased fracture risk or brittle bones in infants with EDS. So there are cases going through the court system in Florida right now in which Hollick is listed as an expert. But again, your child protection team consultant ought to be able to help you deal with them. Okay, so these are the facts, which just goes over what I've already said, that it affects skin and joints, but it doesn't cause broken bones. Oh, and this is the point again. Dr. Hollick will look at a copy of a CD of the original x-rays and claim he sees signs of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome that the radiologists who looked at the original x-rays didn't see. So again, if you have one of these cases and Hollick is going to be testifying that he sees Ehlers-Danlos syndrome in those x-rays, get your radiologist involved to counter. Quick word about bone density. A lot of you have probably had bone densitometry studies. You know that this is a way of assessing your bone health. It's very useful in adults and older teens. But what I want you to know is that the American Academy of Pediatrics has stated that bone densitometry studies do not play any role in infants, okay? There are no reliable standards in infants. So the reason you need to know that is if you have some expert claiming that we did bone densitometry studies on this 6-month-old infant and it showed that he had weak bones, that's crap, because the AG says you can't use that study in infants that young. Okay. Now, this is a comment for all the medical providers in the room. This is an article from Carol Jenny back 10 years ago now, where she talked about how we need to build our case. And this is one situation in which, because there are now all of these alternative theories circulating, we medical providers need to do a better job of building that case from the ground up from day one when the baby's in the hospital. It's not really sufficient anymore because of these other people who come in. It's not really sufficient anymore to just look at the child, look at the x-rays, and say this is abuse. If there are multiple fractures in an infant, we really need to build a case by getting some studies. And what we need is the complete skeletal survey, obviously, calcium, phosphorus, alkaline phosphatase. And I'm not going to go into why all these things. We need a vitamin D level. I added the parathyroid level. That wasn't in Dr. Jenny's article, but that ends up being important to rule out congenital rickets. So we need that. So we need to build that medical case from day one in the hospital. Because if we don't get those studies now, then 3 months from now, someone's going to be claiming the baby had congenital rickets, and we won't have the studies to prove that that's not the case. Because if we get these studies now, we can prove there's no evidence of rickets. We can prove the calcium's normal, the PTH is normal. We can prove that's all normal now, and that cuts off that defense later. Okay, we talked about head injuries and broken bones. Now we're going to talk about just one false theory related to sexual abuse and assault cases. The idea being that if there has been penetration, there must be an injury. Okay, common defense. We'll go over 3 reasons why it's not true, which is that sometimes inside isn't inside. Sometimes you get penetration without injury. Sometimes you get penetration with injury, but it heals. So we'll go over those points. This is an article by one of those guys who will come into court and claim that if there has been penetration, if there has been genital penetration, there has to be an injury. You have to see signs of an injury. Okay, his name is Harrington. Okay, so problems. There are many problems with this study. He ignores everything, all the studies that disagree with him, including studies based on confessions. Okay. He says all the confessions were coerced, so he doesn't believe in confessions. Okay. He discounts articles that show complete healing, which I will share one of those articles with you. He has this strange preoccupation with the diameter of the average adult penis. And the size of the you read it, it's really, seriously, it's strange. Okay. Speaking of which, though, there was a period of about 2 weeks back in 1990 when we thought it was 1983. About 2 weeks back in 1993 when we thought we had a magic number. Someone published an article indicating that if the hymeneal diameter was more than 4 millimeters, the child had been penetrated. Absolute fault, and there are many reasons why that's not true. Time doesn't let me go into them all. Suffice it to say that this is absolutely not true. No one who works in child abuse even bothers to measure the hymeneal diameter anymore. We don't even bother to measure that because it's a meaningless number. Okay. So what's the first reason why penetration can occur without an injury is that sometimes inside is not quite the same as inside. Okay, so this is a picture of a little girl's bottom with her legs together. Okay, and that's all you can see. Okay, but then when her legs are spread, that's when you see all the genitalia. Okay, the clitoris, the urethra, the labia minora, the vaginal orifice, the hymen, the fossa. That's where you see all that. All of this is inside. Let me just back that up, okay? That's outside, that's inside, okay? So if we look at this laterally, okay, if you ask an adult woman what inside is, she's probably going to tell you up here in the vagina, okay? But everything in this space here, everything here, this is everything between the labia, this would be the outer limits of the labia majora, labia minora. All of this is inside the child's personal genital space, okay? That's medically speaking, and I'm not a lawyer, but as I understand it in law too, that's inside. So if you penetrate in there, penetration has occurred. So a 4-year-old girl who tells you that he was inside me, he put his penis inside me, she's not necessarily meaning it's up here. She doesn't know the difference. If he was rubbing it in there, that's inside to her, and it's inside for the law too. So that's penetration, but it's not going to leave an injury. So that's one reason why a little girl can tell you that he was inside me, but there hasn't been any injury. Okay. Another reason is that even when there is penetration into the vagina, there's not always an injury. Okay, this was an interesting study where they had people review photographs of the hymens of pregnant teenage girls. Okay, one of them was less than 14 years old, pregnant with her second child. She'd had a hysterectomy. No, she'd had it. No, she'd had a C-section with her first child, but. What they found was of these 36 pregnant girls, only 2 had definite signs of penetration, that is, healed transsexuals of the hymen. Now, the hymen is a subject of a different topic, but the best analogy that I usually use when I'm talking to a jury or whatever about the hymen is that it's like a hair scrunchie. Sometimes I will wear a hair scrunchie on my wrist, and at the appropriate time, take it off. You know, you can put a hair scrunchie on your wrist, take it off, and the hole in the hair scrunchie is, I mean, it's non-existent, but it'll stretch and go over your wrist and then go back to the way it was. So the teenage adolescent hymen, that's how nature kind of designed it. Nature didn't design the hymen to be damaged with intercourse. It is sometimes, but most of the time it's not. So most of the time when there's penetration, there is no visible injury. Because again, think of the hymen as a stretchy thing that often stretches and accommodates intercourse without any injury. Okay. And in fact, this is a famous article by Dr. Joyce Adams, Examination Findings in Legally Confirmed Child Sexual Abuse Cases. It's normal to be normal. That's the title. It's normal to be normal. These are cases where there were convictions and or confessions. So these are legally determined. The thing to emphasize is there were only 14% of these, and this was a series that included both preteens and teens. Only 14% had definitive findings. So again, even when there has been sexual abuse, there's usually not going to be any physical finding. Okay. But suppose that there has been, suppose we have a prepubertal or teenage girl, and there has been vaginal penetration, and there has been a hymeneal tear, there has been an injury, okay? If we see that child quickly, this is one reason we do want to see acute sexual assaults promptly. If there's been bleeding and we see them quickly, we may find an injury. But if time passes, and of course children especially often delay revealing what happened, things will heal. This was a study by McCann, one of a couple of studies along this line done by Dr. McCann, where they looked at photographs of hymeneal injuries. There were 113 prepubertal preteen girls, 126 pubertal adolescents, all of whom were sexual victims. And bruises, abrasions, and submucosal hemorrhage resolved pretty quickly, 3 or 4 days most of the time. When lacerations occurred, when there were hymeneal lacerations, by 10 days, 9 of 11 prepubertal girls had no injury left. Okay, and they saw these kids acutely, they got photographs of injuries, they saw them 2 weeks later, injuries were gone. Healed, no scarring, no nothing, okay? So we have great documentation that even when there has been an injury, it can heal without scarring. Now, yes, sometimes there is scarring, sometimes you'll have a healed transection, kind of a gape in the hymeneal rim, but by and large, most of the time, it heals and goes back to normal. Nature designed this system to be used again and again, so it heals pretty well. So for all of those reasons, these are reasons why children who've been sexually abused say he was inside me may have normal exams. One thing to emphasize that I don't think is emphasized enough often, frequently, is that perpetrators are careful to avoid hurting the child. Now, stranger abductions are different, okay? When a stranger abducts a child and takes them off, they will do whatever they want with the child. They aren't planning to return that child, okay? But most of the time, as we know, the sexual abuser is someone in the family or the circle of family friends, okay? He doesn't want to hurt that child. If he hurts the child, she's going to stop cooperating, okay? If he hurts her, she may tell someone. So they get good at getting their jollies from the child without doing anything that leaves an injury. So they're very careful not to hurt the child most of the time. So that's one reason why you don't have findings. The penetration between the labia, as I said, the so-called perineal intercourse might not cause an injury. They stretch and may not be hurt. Children delay, so if there is an injury, it may have healed. So for all those reasons, there may have been penetration with no signs of injury. So again, don't buy the claim from a defense expert that there's no injury, therefore she couldn't have been penetrated. And these, I won't go through this whole list, but it's in your handout just in case these are common myths, common misunderstandings that people will frequently have. Okay, busy slide. This unfortunately is not in your handout, but I want to discuss it because it's going to be important. And I was going to have George talk about this because he's the lawyer, but he does dependency work. He does dependency work, and this applies to criminal cases.
What he said.
This applies to criminal cases, so he hasn't actually had to deal with this. What this is about, and this is important. A couple of years ago, the Florida legislature passed a law that if someone from out of state wants to come into Florida and testify in a criminal case, they have to get a temporary medical license to testify because providing medical testimony is a form of medical practice, okay? So that, and there are a lot of different reasons why they may want that temporary, but it specifically says to provide testimony in criminal child abuse and neglect cases. Unfortunately, only criminal child abuse cases. It does not include dependency cases. And recently there was a judge who ruled in a sexual abuse case that, sexual abuse is different, it doesn't apply. So he let someone come in and testify on a sexual abuse case because he didn't consider that child abuse. That judge did. There is now legislation before the Florida legislature as we speak that would expand this to include dependency cases and sexual abuse cases. So going forward, listen for the end of the legislative session, this may apply. Now, what's the reason that the bar to get one of these temporary licenses is very low? $50 and you're showing a medical license, okay? And if the board doesn't act on it in a timely manner, you automatically get it. So it's not like it's a real disincentive in terms of trouble for people to get this temporary license. But the teeth in this are that when you come in from out of state and give expert testimony, you subject yourself to potential discipline by the Board of Medicine. So suppose you come in from out of state and provide demonstrably unsound, false medical testimony. You could be reported to the Florida Board of Medicine and you could be disciplined. You could have your Florida license revoked. And what does that mean for the rest of your career traveling around the United States and testifying? When you go to testify in West Virginia, they can work, doctor, did you have your license in Florida revoked for testimony? So the hope and expectation is that this will make these traveling carnival experts think twice before they come to Florida. They can come, but they put themselves then under the jurisdiction of the Florida Board of Medicine and can be held responsible. Florida, as far as I know, is the only state in the union that has that. When I talked about this at the San Diego meeting in January, there was widespread interest in this kind of legislation as a way to tamp down some of the irresponsible testimony. So I'm hopeful that in the near future we'll be able to expand this to dependency and sexual abuse cases as well. Now with that, I'm going to turn it back over to George to sum up.
The only other thing I wanted to add was if you have a case and you're making a filing decision or if you're determining whether to continue to go forward on it and the other side puts forward a doctor, a well-known doctor who gives their opinion and it basically disproves what your theory is, don't just cave in. Reach out to your expert at the Child Protection Team and run it past them. Just because Dr. So-and-so writes something on a piece of paper doesn't mean that it actually happened. It might be their buddy or their neighbor or whatever who's going to just do a favor for them. Other than that, that's about it.
Okay. Any first questions? No questions? Yes.
We have the congenital rickets is trendy in our jurisdiction right now. Pretty much every multiple fracture case we have, there's some expert that comes in. There's one doctor in particular. How long does a baby have to be formula fed for the mom's vitamin D levels to not matter?
It doesn't matter from the word go. It doesn't matter from the word go.
We had a particular case of a homicide. Baby had like 56 fractures, and mom was severely vitamin D deficient. But the baby was formula fed from birth, never breastfed. And it was Dr. Delasnik, I don't know if you're familiar, and he's terrible. It wasn't an issue, and our doctor wasn't relying on scans. He said, I held this baby's bones, I cut this baby's bones. Like, this baby did not have, this wasn't a congenital rickets thing. But when you have these battles of the experts, you have these jurors who they're just like, they got a ninth grade education and they're trying to weed through it.
The answer to the basic answer to your question, like how long do you be formulated for that not to matter, is any such thing as speculation, because I don't know that anybody has done any such study. But again, unless the mother might have been vitamin D deficient, she might have been vitamin D deficient, but she probably didn't have bone disease. She probably had plenty of calcium. And that placental parathyroid related hormone that her placenta made would have sucked calcium from the mother into the baby. There's an old wives' tale in the old days. It used to be said that a mother would lose a tooth for every baby. Heard that? It's just a way of saying that the baby gets its calcium from the mother. Unless she had rickets herself, her vitamin D level, I would say it's not really important because the baby got his calcium from her anyway. Other questions? Okay, yes.
How does Ehlers-Danlos relate to non-fracture injuries like bruises and dislocations and things like that?
Okay, excellent question, thanks. Ehlers-Danlos syndrome cases, those kids do bruise easily. Their subcutaneous tissues are not very strong. They do bruise easily. They can dislocate joints easily. So with bruises, that could be an issue. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you.